Hi, Jamie here. I'm one of the co-founders of Jacobs Burger. Thank you for taking some time to watch this video. Today, I'm talking about the very serious topic of domestic violence. More specifically, I'm talking about the consequences of having a final restraining order entered against you. Those consequences can be severe. They can impact every area of the defendant or accused abuser's life. So it's important to understand what a final restraining order is and how it can impact you. Because a final restraining order severely and permanently impacts the rights of the accused, courts in New Jersey do not enter these types of orders lightly. There's a hearing that's required, and the proof that needs to be submitted by the victim who is accusing somebody of domestic violence is a high bar that they have to reach. They have to prove that an act of domestic violence happened, and they also have to prove that there's an ongoing need for the protections afforded under the Prevention of Domestic Violence Act. A final restraining order hearing typically occurs very quickly after a temporary restraining order is issued. And the reason for this is because at a temporary restraining order, the bar that the victim has to show in order for a temporary restraining order to enter in terms of evidence is less than at a final restraining order hearing. Courts are in the business of trying to protect victims of domestic violence. So they have to act quickly with a temporary restraining order, but they want to ensure that the rights of the defendant, if they are wrongfully accused, are not impacted for so long. So they have these hearings on a summary basis. That also means that in this type of hearing, you're not allowed to engage in full-blown discovery. So oftentimes these hearings are happening within a week to 10 days of the entry of the TRO. If after a final restraining order hearing, the final restraining order is in fact issued, you want to ensure both the victim and the defendant that you are aware of all of the provisions contained in that final restraining order. While many final restraining orders have similar provisions, there are certain nuances that may be specific to yours, such as parenting time or financial obligations or distance that you have to stay from a particular area. So you want to make sure that you're aware of every single provision in there. And the reason for that is because violating a restraining order in New Jersey, temporary or final, has serious implications. In New Jersey, you may have mandatory jail time that comes with violating restraining order. So again, you want to make sure you know every single term in there. So what are some of the common provisions that you may see in a final restraining order? You may see limits on where a defendant can go, things that limit the amount of distance that they can be to the victim. Another common provision is they may not be able to return to the marital home other than to collect some belongings with a police escort. There is a provision in all final restraining orders which prohibits the defendant from purchasing or possessing any firearms and requires that defendant to relinquish those firearms to the state. Those were just a few of the common provisions that I see in a final restraining order. There are so many more, and you want to ensure that you're aware of what is in there and what your rights and obligations are. So make sure you're consulting with an attorney if a final restraining order has been entered against you or if you're a victim of domestic violence. It's also important to know that a final restraining order may impact custody and parenting time. Whether you're going through a divorce or you're separating from a co-parent, there may be implications to the defendant as to this area. So it's important to understand what impact a final restraining order can have on custody and parenting time. While sometimes those provisions are temporary in nature, you want to make sure you're consulting with an attorney. There may also be a requirement that the defendant undergo anger management courses or a substance abuse evaluation. So again, you want to be clear on the nuances of your final restraining order. There are instances when a final restraining order is entered and a defendant is simultaneously charged with a crime for the domestic violence incident in New Jersey. Even when they're not criminally charged, there's a requirement when a final restraining order is entered that the defendant is fingerprinted and they're put through a central registry. Some job applications that you file may require a criminal background check. And while generally the final restraining order does not appear, there are instances where employers will do a more in-depth search and your final restraining order registry may pop up. So there can be impacts of having a final restraining order on your career. There can also be a financial implication when a final restraining order is issued. Typically, a defendant will have to pay a mandatory fine. There is also a requirement in certain cases that the defendant pay expenses for the victim on an ongoing basis and potentially counsel fees. So, again, it's really important that you're consulting with an attorney to understand what your obligations may be. Thank you again for watching this video. I hope you take away how important it is, whether you're the victim of domestic violence or you're accused of domestic violence wrongfully, to understand your rights and the obligations that may happen and the implications that may happen as a result of a final restraining order. Please don't hesitate to pick up the phone and call our office because our attorneys are qualified in this area of law and we're here to help.